Here is Van Dieman's Tiger Snake, and I'm calling this a green, even though it has a kind of golden brown with a green, heavy green lean to it. The swatch certainly looks very brown with a green lean, but this is definitely a green. There is very slight tone shift as the paper changes, and the shading is always awesome to see. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, its performance is generally good, and any slight aggression it can have isn't too bad. I like how confusing at times this ink can be as a color, and I'm calling this a winner for how it keeps you kind of on your toes depending on the paper.
The pen for today is a Franklin Christoph Model 66. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we can see that beautiful, beautiful green shading to brown, so a little bit of a spoiler there. It looks fantastic, the truest showing of the color of the ink, I think, on this very white paper, where it does not feather, does not spread, does shade. But look at the shading in those darker areas, where it goes almost towards a golden brown. So it's a little bit of what is so good about green inks. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Apricot. Here is Van Dieman's Pepperberry. Here is Van Dieman's Midnight Sky. Here is Van Dieman's Sweetheart Cherry.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, not as well as on the Clairfontaine, but does shade well. You see elements of the shading in most of the words, like when you look at elements on the second line, where the E is a little bit darker than the L, then the E becomes a little bit darker, the M darker still, the EN lighten just a little bit, where the TS at the end do become a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is lighter and brighter of a green than we had on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade, but the shading shows none of the golden brown tones that we saw with the Clairfontaine. It only becomes a little bit darker of a green. Very bright, refreshing tone of green. I think it looks nice. It is, I believe, being affected by the tone of the paper, meaning the ink we have here is a bit more translucent. Looking at the back of the page, there's only a couple of spots where the ink got deeper into the paper. Otherwise, we have no bleeding and no ghosting, so that you could continue your notes back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, but not as well as the Clairfontaine. It shades to a much darker green than most of the writing, but it does not show that golden brown-ish lean that the Clairfontaine did in its shading. Does it stand out against the quad rule? This is a close call. For me, this is going to be a no because I see them at the same time, which is not my preferred. But for you, this might be a yes. I see this as really on the borderline. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks.
Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters number 2.
Here is Colorverse Office Green.
Here is Diamine Meadow. Here is Levenger Always Greener.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here, the tone we get is lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade much better than I expected on this paper, but nowhere near as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. I think the slightly less white paper here makes it a little bit better for this ink with the quad rule, though me personally, I still don't go for this. Would I tell a student to stop using it if this is what they were using? No, because I can still read without any kind of problems what's there. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Pilot Yuyaki Sunset.
Here is Sailor Studio 752.
Here is Monteverde Black Ash. Here is Noodler's Widowmaker.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is noticeably lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does have tiny bits of feathering that do occur in conjunction with the little bit of shading that also occurs. When the little bit of shading occurs, so does a little bit of feathering. Not something that would stop somebody from using this. Does it have some spread? Yes, just slightly. But I do think you could use this, though it wouldn't really be my recommendation because of the very light tone, even though it's quite readable here. Looking at the back of the page, we see a lot where it's deep into the paper, a normal thing for copy paper. Not too bad when it comes to the ghosting. Could you write back here? I think you could. Would I? I would not.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Franklin Christoph Model 66 has a broad sig that writes with a medium flow. It gives great tone and shading. Off camera, I tried this in a wet fine to see how it affected the tone or the color of the brownishness of the swatch, which does come through quite a bit more, and the shading got even stronger. So that brownishness that I talked about in the beginning that you only slightly see in the writing sample, I was more talking about from my off-camera experience. So I want what happens to the tone and the shading from a wet pen, but want the flair of a stub. So I go for a wet stub to get this great green brownish lean combined with the great shading. Thanks for watching.